Hi, my name is Kevin Brothlett, Army Sustainment Command historian, and we are continuing our 75th anniversary of 1945 leading up to VE Day, Victory in Europe. So thank you again for following the series. We really appreciate it, and apologize for the different format that we have to have here due to COVID, but we're trying to power on, and hopefully you'll follow on with us. So what we're looking at here is the overall map, to backtrack a little bit for the overall campaign here, showing the Normandy invasion landings to the north here, and the approximate Allied line with this dotted line on 24 July 1944, and then down to the south, Operation Dragoon, which takes place in 15 through 28 August of 1944 as well. Stepping up forward, we see the approximate Allied line starting 14 September 1944. This is when the Allies started meeting really heavy resistance, as well as, well, not meeting fully heavy resistance, but starting to struggle with the supply lines, as most of the supplies for the entire front for Allied soldiers was coming from the Normandy beachhead still. So forward advancing was starting to slow a little bit. You see here the advance or progress between September and December of 1944. 15 December was just shortly before the Battle of the Bulge starts, which obviously sets us back a little bit, especially for our future campaigns that we were planning coming spring of 1945. Here you see the approximate Allied lines as of 7 March 1945. This is following the conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge and the first of the spring offensives pushing into Germany itself. Then you see a big step forward, going all the way up to 2 May 1945, showing the Allied lines, Western Allied lines, advance into Germany itself, and with Torgau being highlighted here, which is where the Western Allies met the Eastern Soviet Allies for the very first time. And since, that last line going across was First Army's path going through Europe. But again, just stepping back, these are some of the major stepping points that you see here. This is Operation Lumberjack, which is 1 through 7 March 1945. This was part of an overall campaign across the entire Western Allied front to break into Germany, crossing the Rhine. Now, here's focus for First Army, looking for places to cross the Rhine River. And they weren't actually supposed to cross the Rhine first. It was supposed to be the British to the north as part of a larger airborne invasion. But as things happen, First Army finds, after getting through fighting to Cologne, and then Bonn to the further south. So Cologne here on the map is to the north, and Bonn is in the middle here. They were starting to push their way down with the intent to meet up with Third Army to the south. And on their way down, they ended up hitting the city of Remagen, where Ludendorff Bridge was, and the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. So First Army manages to cross the Rhine here, and they were the first soldiers to cross the Rhine, the first enemy soldiers in Germany during wartime since the time of Napoleon. What you see here is, again, starting in April 1945, we see the large picture to the left is showing the huge number of German prisoners that the Allies, and particularly the Americans, that were taking. The 1st and 9th Armies had circled the German Army Group B, known as the Ruhr River Pocket, and this picture was actually the result of that. And with such a large surrender of German soldiers, the Allies knew that the back of the German army was broken, and they started advancing east after a reduction of the pocket, trying to get in further into Germany and in the race for Berlin in the larger scheme of things. The picture here shows the surrender by 18 April with 317,000 German soldiers surrendering, including 24 generals. And this is just a map showing it. The large circle here is the overall area of the pocket where the surrender took place. The German soldiers had been surrounded by the 9th Army to the north and 1st Army to the south, resulting in that overall surrender. But you can see the overall advance of all the Allies to the east, with obviously Berlin being the primary goal. But Torgau, which you see here, is the position where east meets west. So 20 through 25 April 1945, First Army was ordered to slow its advance due to negotiations between the Western Allies and the Germans for potential surrender. Now, it was seen in certain ways that the Germans were trying to buy time, because the Soviet armies to the east were, literally knocking on the doors of Berlin, and that feigning negotiations with the West, seeing if they could get more favorable conditions out of the Western Allies, was part of this. And so the picture you see to the right here are actually part of the German soldiers that were surrendering. In April alone, over 435,000 German prisoners were taken by the Western Allies. This is quite a substantial portion of the remaining German forces there. But the writing was on the wall. The war was coming to a conclusion, and these Germans wanted to surrender to the West as opposed to the Soviets, the Russians, to the east. Elements of the 69th Infantry Division's intelligence and reconnaissance units make initial contact with the Soviets. And so there was a really murky situation here, where we knew the Soviets were to the east. Our aerial reconnaissance were seeing where the Soviets, roughly where the Soviets were. And one of the things that Eisenhower in particularly was concerned about was we didn't want to run into the Soviets and start fighting them. We wanted to meet them as allies and not as combatants on the field, in the zeal for trying to take out the German soldiers in between. So after the 69th Division's INR units make contact, the initial contact, a formal meeting is set up on April 25th, where First Army officials officially meet the Russians at Torgau. And this is actually one of the prints that were made by First Army engineers during World War II, showing where the 69th Infantry Division was, and the route that they had taken to Torgau, as the American soldiers, particularly in this section, First Army, had been ordered to halt so that they would not run into the Soviets or have an unfortunate casualties due to friendly fire in this case. So they did meet at Torgau, and it was one of the momentous moments during the war, symbolizing that the war was coming to a close. East meets west. And so the picture to the left here are soldiers of the 69th Infantry Division meeting the Russian counterparts on the Elbe River on a destroyed bridge there, and much partying and happiness ensued after that. But nevertheless, the picture to the right actually shows General Hodges, who is seated here roughly in the center, along with his Russian counterpart, celebrating East meeting West, and the impending conclusion of the war on 30 April 1945. And as a side note, when General Hodges met with the Russians, they ended up exchanging some gifts, and General Hodges gave an American Jeep and a First Army flag to the Russians. So April to May 1945, there's a lot that's going on, not just the combat taking place. So on 30 April 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide, appointing Admiral Karl Dönitz as the Chancellor of Germany that would follow him. General Hodges was notified that First Army would be heading to the Pacific, and so First Army was actually moved off of the front lines, and it was the very first army within Europe that in large part was actually removed off, or was disengaged from combat in plans to be moving to the Pacific. And most of its divisions and its subordinate units were either handed out to other units or started their preparation for movement to the Pacific as well. By 2 May, all German forces in Italy surrender. So again, that was another significant movement that the war was over in Italy. But it was not yet VE Day. Not all of Europe was under the included within that surrender. So we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth here, but the 7th and 8th of May, the German surrender of overall surrender was made, and the formal announcement was made, excuse me. and they were moving forward with signing the final surrender documents there. And so the picture to the right is the newspaper headline when news was announced that Hitler had committed suicide. And again, the writing was on the wall that the war was coming to a rapid conclusion. What you see here with the surrenders, and one of the reasons why we dedicated an entire talk to this, was that the surrender was very confused in large part. So General Eisenhower and the Western Allies, along with representatives of the Soviet Union, had been in talks with the Germans, for a number of days, and it's basically since the middle of April. And at the same time, there were different German representatives that were trying to seek better circumstances from the Western Allies. So everybody's trying to cut their little piece of the German government up and say, hey, I'm the one in charge, especially following Hitler's death, going to the Western Allies and trying to, get as favorable conditions for them, the representatives, as anything else. So on May 7th, 1945, at 2:41 a.m., German representatives and Allied representatives meet at the College of Modern Technology in Reims, France, which was the current SHAEF, or Strategic Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces Command Headquarters. General Eisenhower, there had been talk going back and forth between the German representatives and Eisenhower, particularly in this case Jodl, Field Marshal Jodl, which is the German representative at this time, that they were wanting to negotiate. They were wanting to get favorable terms of surrender, and a hero of Eisenhower's, his predecessor, Ulysses S. Grant, he said that all surrender discussions would be unconditional. So what you see here to the right is actually part of the unconditional surrender, but the overall synopsis is highlighted to the left. Said, it is agreed by the German emissaries, undersigned, that the following German officers will arrive at a place and time designated by the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, and the Soviet High Command prepared with plenary powers to execute a formal ratification on behalf of the German High Command of this act of unconditional surrender of the German Armed Forces. Now, they did sign the surrender, as you see to the right, on the 7th at 2:41. And the interesting thing about it was that within 6 hours, the Soviet government protested. That they said that the Soviet representative that was there was not authorized to sign for the German surrender. And here's a picture of General or Field Marshal Jodl signing the Germans' unconditional surrender on May 7th, 1945. There was also a large contingent of press that was involved in the room, and representatives from the American government, the British government, and the French government, as well as the Soviets, all signed this document. So, like I said, there was the Soviets protested. They said that the instrument of surrender was unacceptable. The Soviets had not been properly basically discussed or brought into the conversation as to the negotiations of the surrender. They also said that the surrender document outlined that German military forces would stop fighting. That it did not mention anything about disarming the German soldiers or anything like that. It just said that they would stop fighting. Whereas the Soviets wanted, in their surrender document, an overall statement saying that the German soldiers would be seen as prisoners and immediately disarmed. Additionally, they thought that it was improper to have the surrender document signed in the country of a victim of the German aggression. And so having it signed in France, they thought it was inappropriate for that. And so they wanted to have it signed as a historic, symbolic, singular event, like it says here. The Soviet objection was that the act of surrender ought to be a unique, singular, historic event, fully reflecting the leading contribution of the Soviet people to the final victory. Now, the Soviets obviously had reached the outskirts of Berlin and were fighting in the city at this time as well. So the May 8th surrender So the surrender part 2 or part 2 would be signed in Berlin. And again, there was a lot of conversations and a lot of pomp and circumstance that was going on here to, not only signify the end of the war, but to embarrass the German representatives at the same time. This was considered a formal surrender, and even Eisenhower had agreed that his initial surrender on 7 May was improper, that how it had taken place. But nevertheless, it had resulted in a stopping of combat actions, at least on the Western Front, between the Western Allies and the German soldiers. Combat actions, for the most part, took place continually, at least until in large scale, until the morning of the 9th of May, when the surrender was officially took place. The actual signing took place early in the morning of May 9th, but it was backdated to May 8th to be a symbolic date, as well as to comply with the earlier surrender on the 7th of May as well. And you see here General Field Marshal Keitel and Admiral Friedberg signed the German instrument of surrendering all forces. So basically all German military forces representatives were here at this, representing the German government and signing the surrender, official dated 8 May 1945. Now, something that I feel was very telling is that obviously I followed First Army a lot through this. This was actually what is known as an INSUM, or intelligence summary, of First Army's intelligence section. And this was written as of May 7th, midnight, May 7th, 1945. For the first time in 11 months, there is no contact with the enemy. The victory which was won on Omaha and Utah beaches has reached its climax. Today belongs to the men of this army, who fought and conquered the enemy from Normandy to the Elbe River. There is no situation to report, for there is no longer an enemy to defeat. So a very symbolic end to First Army's war here, war in Europe. Now, like the negotiations about how the surrender took place, and there's already politics, basically ever since the Americans had gotten into the war, and it wasn't because of us, but there was all these very delicate political negotiations between all of the allies involved fighting against Germany, and then obviously later in Japan, as to how the war was going to end and what the results of the war would be, and how post-war Europe would look. The disagreements and negotiations even take place all the way down to, or political maneuvering even takes place down to the announcement of the surrender. So General Eisenhower, when he had his surrender signed on May 7th, 1945, there was quite a few press individuals involved in the signing, and taking pictures and video of the event, because obviously it's a historic event, and so he wanted to have it covered for posterity. And you see, after that surrender, General Eisenhower actually made the press, members of the press that were involved, promise that they would have a news blackout for about 30 hours. He didn't want any news of the surrender to be announced until 9 May 1945, which he saw as the day that would be VE Day. So it was a day that all of the Allied forces could celebrate. Now, with everything going on with the press, and their difficult ability, or their inability to keep a good press story quiet, the news of the actual surrender was leaked almost immediately. And it ended up getting published by an Associated Press reporter who was at the 7 May surrender on 8 May. And so news throughout the Western Allies started spreading through the population that the war was over. You see here is actually a picture on the 8th of May 1945 with an American soldier standing overwatch as all of these German prisoners are being processed here with holding a newspaper saying Nazis quit the war, VE Day today. So the Western Allies generally celebrate 8 May as VE Day, whereas the Soviets celebrate 9 May, as well as a number of other Eastern Bloc countries, former Eastern Bloc countries celebrate 9 May as their VE Day. So once VE Day is celebrated or is announced, the world explodes in celebration. And this is actually a picture within New York City showing some of the celebrations taking place. Obviously, in every major and minor city across the Western Allies, there's celebrations. In England, they have these, it's really cool, they have these picnics where they have basically tables are placed in the middle of their streets going through neighborhoods, and so the entire neighborhood would come and celebrate VE Day as a community together. And you see, obviously a lot of the press photos of the soldiers kissing their girlfriends or women, celebrating the end of the war. However, it was not the end of the war. It was the end of the war in Europe. The picture to the right here shows 77th Division soldiers on Okinawa listening over the radio to reports of the German surrender. The war in Europe was over, but their war was not yet over. The Japanese government was still holding out, and would be another couple months, obviously, before the war in the Pacific was ended as well. But the United States starts shifting, and a lot of the Western powers, Allied powers, I should say, start shifting their focus to ending the war in the Pacific as well. Some of the negotiations that come out of the VE Day negotiations was that the Soviets would declare war on Japan and then start a land campaign against Japanese forces in Manchuria and places like that. So that never actually takes place, but Soviet Union does declare war against the Japanese later in the war. But we'll talk about that later. But with that said, I know it's a little bit shorter than normal, but that is overall the discussion of VE Day and March through May of 1945. Thank you very much for listening, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You see our phone numbers down in the lower right-hand corner there. But we look forward to talking to you next month and following up with the more of the Pacific campaign as it continues to the end of the war, or VJ Day victory over Japan. But thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you soon.